you so much for coming to our best practices for math differentiation webinar this afternoon. We appreciate you coming. Just some webinar logistics and introductions. We want to thank the New Hampshire Department of Education. They are the ones that sponsor this particular webinar series. We're able to bring it to you for free. There are so many webinars that they have sponsored for all of us and everybody around the state. So we thank them for this partnership. Just so you know, everyone is muted. We can't hear you. We can't see you. That also means when you have questions, could you please enter them in the Q&A portion of your Zoom screen? We will be looking at them periodically. As I'm talking, Annie will be taking a peek, and as Annie's talking, I'll be taking a peek. So we'll be checking it there. Because it is a webinar format, it's a little tricky to have you raise your hand and unmute you. Although if we hit the end of the webinar and we have a little bit of extra time, we can try to do that. The big question of the day, and what we will get questions throughout the webinar, is where is the PD certificate? Will you have access to this Google slide or PowerPoint? The answer is yes. You will get an email tomorrow that will be coming from, most likely from Elizabeth Dion. It will give you a link to your PD certificate. It will point you in the direction of where the recording of this webinar will be, and then any sort of other materials like the PowerPoint slides and everything. There are a lot of links in the slides, so we will get you the information. Also, in the next couple of weeks or so, we will also get you the link to the Canvas site that is from the Department of Ed that will have the webinar information as well, the recording and a transcript and the slides. So we'll get all of that to you as soon as we can get it to you. Big thing as well, we love feedback. Any feedback that you have, we really take a look at, and we try to modify some of the presentations for future. So you'll get a quick survey when we log off of this webinar. There'll also be a link tomorrow in your email. So please take just a couple of minutes. I think it's 4 or 5 questions, and it's super helpful. Here's us today. I'm Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the presenters today. We also have Annie Wallace from the Department of Education, who is another presenter.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate your time.
We also have Tammy Hilton on this particular webinar as well. So she might be taking some of the questions and giving you some of the information as well. All right, I'm going to turn my video off. Also, we'll give you a little bit more room on your screen for you to be able to see. So this is the general gist of what we're going to be going over today. We want to give you a general overview of differentiation and what we think of as differentiation. It may or may not be different from what you're used to hearing. So we want to make sure we're all on the same page there. We're also going to go through the different ways to differentiate, and then how you can transfer specifically to a math classroom, and then we'll have the wrap up and question and answer. So first and foremost, this graphic, I think, sort of encapsulates or shows what we feel like with differentiation, a lot of us, right? So what do you think of when you hear the word differentiation? Most often people think of it as a lot of extra work, a lot of extra planning time and all of that. And today we're going to give you some information that might make you think a little bit differently about differentiation and not feeling like you're on that hamster wheel of trying to differentiate for every single student in your class. We're going to show you some different ways to think about it. So what is it, right? So differentiation is really providing students with opportunities for them to reach high standards. Big deal, high standards, not lowering our standards to make sure that everybody's meeting them, but really keeping those standards high and ensuring that students are reaching their full potential and becoming mathematically proficient and independent learners. So we're getting away from that sort of rote memorization of how to do things, and we're really trying to get them to think independently and to be able to understand the material that's presented to them. So talking about benefits of differentiation. These are just three. There's a ton of benefits, but these are sort of the top three that we're looking at today. We know that differentiation individualizes and personalizes learning. We know that it increases student engagement, and we also know that it allows teachers more creativity and flexibility in their instruction. So we like this graphic. This is what is differentiation and what is it not? So really looking at differentiation, it is effective teaching and ensuring that students learn, right? What it's not is just this sort of bag of tricks or just strategies that really just kind of go in, a low quality curriculum, right? So to differentiate, we want to make sure that that's really rich content and that we are getting to the root of what students really need. It's also looking at the evidence of what student learning is. It's a lot of formatively assessing students to make thoughtful decisions in what you're going to be teaching and how it's presented. So differentiation is not a blue moon. Like it is not necessarily creating all different activities every once in a while to try to hit the needs of all students. It's an everyday thing. And again, we're going to go through some things today that don't make it as overwhelming, right? So it's also tailoring our instruction and responses to what students are learning and what their needs are of that particular skill set, right? So if we're teaching a specific skill, we are constantly taking a look at what the students' needs are with that and making changes accordingly, right? Again, not writing individual lessons plans for every single student. It is also making sure that we have flexible grouping. Differentiation is not grouping kids, keeping them in groups, and having those groups be static. I know a lot of times we group kids and we say, oh yeah, these are flexible groups, but then in reality, we know we actually don't switch up those groups. That's not what we're talking today. We're talking about being able to switch up those groups, having it be flexible and letting students move in and out of where their particular strengths and weaknesses may be. And this is what we're talking about, where we say a way up to the standards and learning goals instead of the way out of standards and learning goals. So basically, we're making differentiation and we are making sure that we are meeting those standards and really getting kids to get to those particular goals, and not necessarily saying, well, we're differentiating it and doing something completely different, and then we lose sight of those standards. And differentiation, critical to improving instruction for all students, not just your low students, not just your high students, but everybody. And so we want to make sure that we're not just dealing with students who might be on an IEP or an English language learner, but this is for everybody. So how we differentiate. We differentiating by offering additional examples sometimes. Maybe we're doing differentiation by making connections to what they have for previous learning. You might have a group of students, you might have more than one section. If you teach middle school or high school, you might have more than one section, and you find one section needs a lot of those connections being scaffolded for them. And another section, they don't need as much of that. They already are able to tap into that previous learning. So you're differentiating. Providing wait time. It's a huge part of allowing students to be able to figure out their thinking, is we need to be able to provide wait time. That's also how they make connections as well. And then explaining a concept in more than one way, right? We find different ways that we might be able to explain it. And, we don't explain it to exhaustion. If you get the deer in the headlights, you explain it a little bit different way, but it doesn't mean that we explain it more and more and more and more. We figure out different ways to be able to have students understand that. So we're going to talk about how we can do that. We can't really talk about differentiation without talking about equity, right? So equity really doesn't mean that every student's getting identical instruction, right? It makes what equity is that it is really looking at what are appropriate accommodations that can be made and making that particular information accessible to all students, right? So some students might need a little bit more and some students might need a little bit less. And so that's what we're talking about here. When we're talking about supports so that students have equity, right? We're talking about making sure that everybody has equal access to the curriculum, right? Doesn't matter. You might have a different teacher somewhere else, but we're making sure that access is available to all students, and that in your own particular classroom, that you're really looking at those educational experience of your students in front of you and making sure that you are helping to really give them that ability to access the education, right? And it's really looking also at when we have specific math programs or we have specific curriculum, we want to make sure that it is high quality, right? We want to make sure that we're not just teaching it, that all students are learning it. We keep the expectations high, and we make sure that the resources that we have maximizes every student's learning potential. And this is, again, we can't talk about differentiation without talking and using a quote from Ann Tomlinson. She has really been on the forefront of differentiation for a long time. So it says teachers that ignore student differences are unlikely to maximize potential in any student who differs significantly from the norm. So we've taught to the middle for a very long time and to what we feel like is the norm. And we need to get away from that. And we need to make sure that we're teaching to all ends of the spectrum, whether they be students that are below our grade level or skills in our grade level and students that are above it. So we're looking at all students in our classroom. And as we're doing that, we want to make sure that, equity is more than just equal opportunity, right? It makes sure that students are able to attain equal outcomes, right? And it is really looking at the students' differences and figuring out how we can ensure that even though they might have a different way of learning, that they are also able to access the curriculum in our classrooms. So these are just some of the ways that we can address the needs of all the students and create opportunities for learning for all students, right? So these are just the different ways. Maybe they have a disability, maybe they have different cultural backgrounds, maybe they're an English language learner, they could be gifted, or they could be maybe unmotivated to learn. We've been talking a lot in education about students who say they are not mathematical people. I'm just not a math person or what have you. So they're unmotivated. So we need to figure out how are we going to tap into those students and how are we going to foster a love of math for students who feel like maybe they're not a math student, or they don't have that sort of math mind. You've seen this graphic most likely already. We have equality, right? Everybody has that same level. There's still kids that are not able to access the curriculum. Equity is really what we're thinking of. How can we make this so that all students can access the curriculum? Some students might need no support. Some students might need greater levels of support, but we're talking really today about that equity in education. There are also some catalysts for change, right? So mathematics here, these are just some of the reasons why we need to think differently about the way that we're teaching. So we have kids leaving elementary school with negative views about math. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not a math kid. They hit middle school and they've already decided whether they're good at math, not good at math. Maybe they had one experience and then it's over, right? So we have to be careful. Part of what the problem is in some cases as well is that there is an overemphasis on memorization and rote understanding of math. We have all of these procedures that we're expecting kids to follow. If they don't have them, there's mathematical thinking and deep conceptual understandings are not necessarily happening. So differentiation can help that. It's also a good indicator of where a student is and how successful they'll be in math is in those early learning grades. So all those teachers that are in the elementary school, it is our job to facilitate and encourage and foster mathematical understanding. And the ability grouping that stays static is tough, right? If a student isn't able to move, even though they understand and they're in a specific setting because of their mathematical skills and they never get out of it, it's tricky. And then the last thing is collaboration. We have not let students talk enough during math. We're thinking they're cheating. We're thinking they're not really thinking for themselves. So collaboration and allowing students to talk with one another is a really big push right now. So just reminders, differentiation is not effective without quality universal instruction, right? We can't don't differentiate just to differentiate. You have to be intentional. We have to know the purpose of why we're differentiating. We need to know where our students are. We need to also, it's almost like a backwards design. Where do we want the outcomes and how are we going to get students there? So now we're going to talk a little bit about the ways to differentiate.
So differentiation really is just the teacher's response to the learner needs. So the main thing is we as teachers want to get to know our students. So we can get to know our students through abilities, interests, learning styles. We have guides and supports for some students, such as IEPs and 504s, but we also have to recognize there may be students who are being challenged in their learning without those supports on our end. And we need to know that some students also have needs beyond the differentiation. We can get to know our students through community building throughout the year. We're creating a math community in our own classrooms. And then we want to assess our students regularly, and we can use things such as, but we're not limited to, summative assessments, formative assessments, our pre-tests, our exit cards, math probes, use of quantile scores, which is the math variation of Lexile scores, and those appear on our state testing and on some of the benchmark testing that people use, such as iReady. We can use checklists, listen into our students' discussion, and look at their work. So educators must get to know their students in order to make instructional decisions that build on students' math identities. If we don't know our students, it's much harder to know what we need to do for them to access the learning. So remember, data drives differentiation, and it's both qualitative as well as quantitative data. What are we seeing in the classroom? What are we hearing when we listen to them talk to each other and work on problem solving?
So this is a graphic here that talks about the different ways that teachers can differentiate. So you've got your classroom elements that you can differentiate, or you can differentiate for student characteristics. I want to go over first how we differentiate for student characteristics. That's basically the backbone. What we're talking about is, again, getting to know your students, and really that's the base for how we're going to be able to differentiate. So the different types of student characteristics that we're talking about is student interest, right? What are the key skills and materials that help us teach our particular math topics, and what is intriguing for students? So we want to make sure that there's high interest. We also want to make sure that we're looking at readiness and constructing tasks that provide choice and different levels of difficulty for students. And then this learning profile is, we're really taking a look at the learning styles, right? How do students learn? What do we need to do to be able to help them? And what can we do to be able to make sure that we're reaching all of those different styles? So starting with interest, differentiating for interest is, we need to make sure we foster the use of prior knowledge. Sometimes we're pulling the prior knowledge out and we're asking students, what is this making you think of? Is there anything we've learned in the past that this reminds you of? And sometimes we're giving it to them, right? And we want to make sure that students have a lot of time for exploration. Math, I know, is a little bit more cut and dry, but exploration in math is really essential for students to be able to have interest and a little bit more understanding. We want a lot of materials, and certain students have different materials that they like, but we need to make sure that we have a lot of different ways for students to be able to use either manipulatives or what have you, to be able to understand things. Student choice is huge. I know it's hard. You have a math program, you have certain problem sets, but we need to give them choice in a lot of different ways, maybe choosing the way that they are solving problems or choosing the ways that they're showing their thinking. And we want to encourage that problem solving and investigation and application of skills. So ways to hook students through interest, right? We need to know our students. What are they actually interested in, right? And tap into that. We want to make sure also that we're giving students achievable challenges, right? There are times in which we know we want to challenge students, and every once in a while we hit the mark, we make it too challenging and then it takes too long. But for the most part, right now, we're trying to almost take our curriculum and make it easier so that the students aren't so challenged because they're checking out. So you have to balance that. We want achievable challenge for students. We also want to make sure that they have a connection between what they're learning and their actual lives, right? So we want to make sure that they're understanding that connection between, this is what I'm learning in math and this is how it's applied in my everyday life, so that we're making sure that we also have connections with them, with their teachers, between students, and just their life in general. This last one is also making sure that we offer new and novel situations for students and different perspectives and approaches to things. The next one is differentiating for readiness. So we need to adjust the degree of difficulty sometimes for students. Sometimes we need to modify problems so that more students can access the information. Sometimes we need to add scaffolds, right? We need to figure out, what do these students need to be able to solve this? For other students, what do we need to take away so that they're able to try to solve this without the scaffolds? And we need to make sure that we're adjusting based on the student's background knowledge. Specifically for students that are new or that have just different life experiences, we need to make sure that they have access to that curriculum. And we need to vary our direct instruction. If we are instructing in the same way day in and day out, then it's not going to work, right? We need to vary that instruction. And the next one is varying or differentiating for our learning profile, right? So learning profiles maybe they have different learning options. They have flexible spaces. Maybe it's presenting or obtaining the information in different modalities, right? Some kids, maybe it's a video. For some kids, maybe you're sitting down and they're looking at a piece of paper and you're explaining that. Some of them, maybe it's up on the board. Maybe some they're working with manipulatives. We need to give them that choice, right? So again, varying those materials and then providing authentic learning opportunities, right? Making sure that they're not just learning a specific skill within a program or within a certain application of it, but that we're giving them those novel situations and providing authentic learning opportunities for them.
Okay, once we just really get to know our students, then we can think about, are we going to modify the content, the process, the product, or the learning environment? So using our student knowledge, we can see the content is what is to be learned. So what are the standards that we're using? What are the learner outcomes that we want? What is the information I have about the student and their interests? And then how can I modify the content to help reach the students? If it's the process I want to differentiate, it's how does the student acquire the information? Am I going to compact the curriculum for some students? Do I need to add in scaffolding? They're missing a pre-skill, so how can I add that in? Gradation of skills and proficiency, flexible grouping and pacing, or having multiple learning tools around the classroom that they can go get. They know which manipulatives they may need or tools that they may need, and can access them freely within the classroom. Effective questioning on our part, and this takes practice. How do we question students without leading them to the answers? And then we want a variety of instructional strategies. We can also differentiate the product, the learning outcome that needs to be given to us. And it's different ways of assessing, different ways of how are they approaching the work or doing what we're giving them to do. Can they write, speak, create, do research, record, share? How is it that we're going to see what they're doing or learning? And then it's also important to keep in mind our learning environment. Do we have standing desks or a place a student can stand? Do we have a variety of seating differences? Sometimes some of the classrooms may have those bouncy ball type chairs. Others may have regular chairs. We could have a table, so there's some collaborative work that can be done in one section of the room while individual work is being done in another. How are we allowing student interactions and student ownership to take place? So the IRIS Center is out of Vanderbilt University, and they have wonderful modules. So the link here is at the top for their differentiated instruction module, and it'll take you to the different places so that you can see when you're differentiating the content, the same concept or skill is being taught, but how it's taught to the students or how you're giving it to the students. And so we can have tiered content. We can provide a variety of materials, scaffolding, learning contracts, compacting. So if you click on those links once you get to the site, it will take you to examples of all of those types of strategies. Then we have the ways we can differentiate the process. We're still teaching the same concept or skill to each student. However, the manner that we're allowing students to make sense of the topic or skill can vary. So we can vary the activities. We can have tiered activities. We can have learning centers, interactive journals, graphic organizer, jigsaw activities, and just the free use of manipulatives that students can choose to help them in their thinking. And then we can differentiate the product. So we're assessing the same concept or skill for every student, but how we assess that could differ. So sometimes it's a video, sometimes it's a written report or what we think of as our summative test. Sometimes it's a performance task. So again, we have different ways listed that you can go in and see how those activities or strategies can apply to how you can differentiate the product for your students. And then differentiate the learning environment. Thinking about where we place our desks, how we're arranging the student desks. I know when I was teaching at one school, we had the old-fashioned student desks, but if I put them in groups of 2, they could easily be turned around so I could form groups of 4, or they could be separated for individual work. So sometimes it just takes a little creativity on your part, thinking about how can you quickly rearrange things when you need to arrange them. How we're storing our materials. What materials do we want students to have easy access to at all times? Do we have places for students to work together, or can we easily create those, like turning the desks together? And can we create centers in our room?
So now what we want to talk about a little bit is we've talked about, what differentiation is. We've talked about different ways in which we can differentiate. So now we want to talk about some of the ways that you can transfer that to your specific classroom. So when we talk about universal instruction, this is what we're going to be starting with. So universal instruction means every student must have access to the full intent of their grade level standards. So this is where it gets tricky for students who are coming in that are below grade level, right? Our automatic reaction to that is, well, we need to give them obviously some understanding and scaffold that and figure out, okay, so what are these prerequisite skills that we're giving them? But we also need to make sure that we continue to keep our eye on, but where do we want them to be within this particular grade level? So we want to make sure that as we are figuring out those prerequisite skills, that we're still keeping our eye on what our grade level standards are. We also need to make sure that we're providing opportunities to learn and, giving them multiple opportunities to show their understanding, right? We also want research and evidence-based strategies to be implemented in the classroom, right? If you're using a specific program, you have those sort of research-based strategies, but we also are going to give you some other ways that you might be able to differentiate or to give the information to your students as well. We're going to talk a little bit about UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, and that should be something that is routine, right? So we're looking at the data, we are driving our instruction on what the data is telling us, and we are looking at what our outcomes are to be able to continue to figure out how we are getting students to what they need to be understanding and what they need to be learning at our specific grade level. Again, high expectations should be held for all students. We know in education right now, it's really hard. We know that we're feeling like they're getting further and further behind, but again, we can't lower that bar. We need to keep those expectations high, and we're going to show you some different ways in which you can do that, and through differentiation here. So this is a graphic. If you were part of our previous webinars, there's a few slides here that overlap where we were talking about the math thinking classroom. So if you were part of that presentation or were able to watch that video, this is what we talked about a little bit there as well, is creating this inquiry-based education model, right? So is it asset or deficit based? So a lot of times we're in our classroom, we say, okay, this is what you're doing well. And we use the word but. This is now what we're going to be working on. We're trying to get rid of that but, because now we've just erased everything that we said that they were doing really well. So we take that but out of the sentence basically, and we say, okay, these are all the things that you are doing well, and this is what we're going to be working on to continue to have your skills improve, right? Just little simple things like that create a completely different environment for students. It is making them really start to look at, these are my strengths, and these are some things that I just haven't gotten yet, but I am going to get. So we want to make sure that we're really thinking about students making those connections, and that their engagement and opportunities remain strong. So when we're using an asset-based perspective, right, it's really shifting from the what's wrong to the what's right and what am I going to continue to improve, right? So we want to have this asset-based approach, right? We're giving them strengths, right? We're not just saying these are all the things you need to do. We're making sure that they understand where their strengths are. We're giving them a lot of opportunities, right? We're not just saying that you're going to just focus on all the problems that we have and make sure that you get these skills. We're looking at different opportunities to show your understanding. We also then have things for students become internally focused, right? I have intrinsic motivation to be able to continue to do well because I have these strengths, and I'm going to continue to hone in and have even more skills to be able to do this, rather than having it be externally focused and having to have all this feedback about, okay, I need this person to explain this to me or what have you. Really creates that little bit more of a, the word in education right now is grit and perseverance and all of that. Asset-based really helps kids really build that up and say, this is what I already know and what can I build upon, rather than this is what's missing and I can't do. And then really it is making sure that students are feeling good about mathematics, That's the bottom line. Mathematics or anything that you're teaching, right? We want them to feel a really positive thing. It's just like when you're a teacher and you have your evaluation. If in your evaluation, all they're doing is telling you everything that you're doing wrong, well, that's not really helpful. You sit there and you say, well, am I doing anything right? Yeah, you are. So this is exactly how we want to make sure that we're working with our students. We're really building them up on what they're doing well. And this is what we're going to continue to help you work on. This next one here is the understanding by design and differentiated instruction. Really, this graphic is just showing us that how this is all really related to one another, right? We're talking about what we're teaching. We're talking about how students, assess their learning. We're then talking also about how differentiation is in that mix, right? Who are we teaching? When are we teaching specific things? Where are we teaching? What does that environment look like? And in the middle here, it's how we teach, right? What are our outcomes? What are we going to make sure that we have all students, understanding? What are student interests in relation to that? What is their readiness in relation to that? And then in our daily lessons, we're really looking at those flexible groupings. Like if we put groups in our classroom, we need them to be flexible. Do we have open-ended problems? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And do we have some, project-based learning that's going on, or do we allow students to be able to show their thinking in different ways, right? The worst thing we can do is pigeonhole students and say, this is the only strategy we can use, just learn it. And this is the only way that you're going to be able to do this particular type of problem. We want students to be able to be flexible in their thinking and to be able to have knowledge and different strategies to be able to solve problems. And we want to really praise that and promote it. We also want students to be relatively efficient. So we want to help guide them in that way as well. So we just want to make sure that all of these things are being thought of when we are doing any type of instruction. Universal design for learning, again, is it's a pedagogy. How do we look at our instruction? What do we value in our instruction? What skills do students need to have? And how are we going to make sure that they're getting that? Right? Anytime we talk about universal design for learning, we talk about the brain. We need to make sure that we're really looking at what students' abilities and capabilities are. And we want to make sure that our classroom is meeting those demands and that change in curriculum. And really the complexity of what our students are bringing to the table right now. It's not the same as it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And we can sit here and we can say, well, kids are different. They're coming in now, but we have to really take a look at that. And we have to change our thinking to make sure we're still meeting the needs of those students. And we're really looking at this last one. I can't express it enough. We have to be done with teaching to the middle. We have to be done with teaching to the norm. It's not working. We don't have many kids in the middle anymore. We have so many more of them that are really coming in at the lower level. We have very few that are higher. So we need to take a look at where our low kids are, where our high kids are. And if we meet the needs of those, then we are automatically meeting the needs of the middle. So we need to really start thinking about our teaching a little bit differently. So getting back to that process and differentiating that process, we want to make sure that we have varied options and different levels of tasks. Open-ended tasks are a really good way to do this. We're going to talk a little bit more about those, but when you create an open-ended task, it allows students that are maybe a little bit lower in their skills to be able to say, okay, these are some strategies or here's some possible answers. And they might choose the really simple ones, but then that same open-ended task for somebody who has a higher skill level, they're starting to come up with answers that are a little bit more complex, and you can challenge students' thinking a little bit more with some open-ended tasks. Also, we want to really start offering different amounts of support for a task, right? So teachers might support some students more than other students. I cannot talk enough about manipulatives, especially in grades 3 and above. Kindergarten through second, you guys are rock stars. All of them are. A lot of 3rd through 5th grade teachers are, and a lot of middle school and high school teachers are. But for the most part, manipulatives start to go by the wayside as the grade levels go up. So really, manipulatives in any way are going to be crucial for students really being able to differentiate their instruction or their learning. And then you want to make sure you're varying the length of time for students to complete tasks. This idea of writing in math and math journals, if you don't do math journals, there's a link right here that talks about how students write about math. They start to write down their strategies. They can go back and look at what their thinking was in solving specific problems. They are really helpful in having students be able to show their understanding to you and to go back and remind them of how they solve their problems. And discussions and collaborative work in your classrooms are game changers. The last thing I want to talk about here too is the 8 standards of mathematical practice. As we talk about math, we think all the time about the skills at our grade level. What are the standards at our grade level that we need to make sure that kids are really understanding? But don't forget about the SMPs, right? These are across K-12. They are the same at every single grade level. A lot of it has to do with problem solving and perseverance, being able to reason abstractly, really showing models of their understanding, being able to look at somebody's reasoning and say, oh, I'm not sure I understand that, and being able to really kind of talk about and collaborate using tools. Obviously, math has precision, right? There's typically right and wrong answers, right? But sometimes what we're really looking at too is how are we figuring out those answers? And sometimes our understanding and our ability to explain our thinking will then lead to precision. And really just making sure that we are looking at these in relation to how students are solving their problems.
So in our differentiation, we're thinking about the students in front of us, how we can meet them and their needs and allow them to access the curriculum at grade level. So there are considerations we need to take in lesson planning. So we want to meet our students' needs. So we're going to think about UDL. We're going to think about our multi-systems of support that we may have in our school, as well as what we can offer in the classroom. Our assessments and our data helps us to ensure that we're knowing where our students are at in the content area, as well as monitoring their progress. And the goal of all of this is we want them to graduate high school ready for the next steps in their lives, rather if it's going right into a career, an apprenticeship program, the military, a 2-year college, a 4-year college, whatever they choose to do afterwards. So there are 3 interwoven elements that we have to keep in mind with our multi-tiered system of support. We want a high quality curriculum. We want instructional support and interventions or just-in-time interventions. And we want formative assessments that capture the students' strengths and weaknesses. We know where we can build from, and we know what we need to build in the scaffolding for them too. So interventions, we have our explicit strategy, ensuring that even in the middle and high school levels that we're working with a concrete pictorial, representational, and abstract model, and think alouds, model our own thinking aloud and allow in-class discussions that other students are modeling their thinking aloud. And then our teaching and assessing considerations. So how are we structuring the environment? Do we need to remove any potential barriers? Have we identified them? We want to make sure the students understand what we're expecting of them, and we need to consider alternative assessments at times, as well as emphasize practice and summary of their learning. So one of the groups we're considering for are English language learners. So we have to understand there are two types of mathematical knowledge that we're considering. The procedural knowledge, and this is where students from other countries or cultures will vary the most. What we think of as our traditional algorithms are not necessarily the traditional algorithms of another country. Our conceptual knowledge is pretty much across the board universally. We all understand what equality is or inequalities. We understand that ratios are the comparing of two quantities. So our conceptual understandings are pretty universal. It's the procedural understandings that we have to understand maybe where our differences are. So on the left-hand side are some strategies that you can look at. Things like having sentence, vocabulary banks, sentence starters, the use of pictures and diagrams, and let math be social. We learn through just talking with each other. For our mathematically gifted students, we can think about adapting our curriculum in various ways. So adapting the content. So acceleration or compacting, the depth, the complexity of the questions we answer, and that's where parallel tasks and open problems can really support that, increasing the complexity and then creativity. Usually assigning more of the same work, giving free time, assigning gifted students to always work with the struggling learners, providing pull-out activities, and independent enrichment on the computer are not as effective. Problem solving is one of the main avenues we have for differentiation in our classrooms. It's excellent for attending to the breadth of abilities, and it's helping students to apply the math as well as really learn what are the connections they're seeing between quantities and relationships between things. What's the structure that they're discovering? And the problem solving platform does offer flexibility and is a way to really open up the problem so students at all levels in your classroom can find a way to enter and solve as well as extend. Small groups is one way we can help differentiate our classrooms. So we can create our small groups for in many different ways, because just as a teacher, based on what we do, we can take a look at students and put them in different ways. We can base on productivity, peacefulness. Sometimes we want to keep friends together or disruptive students apart. Social goals are another way, and then random grouping, which Peter Lilladell has really put forth in his Building Thinking Classrooms, that I know many people around the state have been reading the book and participating in different book studies and activities around that. Then there's chunking and scaffolding. So students don't naturally chunk big pieces of information into smaller chunks to learn and do. So all big problems can be broken down into smaller problems. And that's a skill. Not only can we help provide for the students in doing it with tasks, but we can also teach them how to do it. And then scaffolding. That's where our math probes, pre-assessments, listening to discussions. Are the students missing a skill that I can scaffold in, or are they ready to take another step so I can scaffold them up to something related to it in the progression? So, and then a lot of it is all about choice as we transfer into the classroom. So the way we can differentiate the tasks or problems is giving choice, our tiered lessons, parallel tasks, open tasks, and then opening and modifying problems are our biggest way to do this for differentiating within our own classrooms. So giving choices, give a problem, but give two choices of what set of numbers they can use in the problem before they solve it. Choice boards or menu boards. So here's an example of a Pythagorean problem solving choice board. And you can tell them, pick two, pick three, pick four, pick one from each column, one from each row, and solve and present your work. If you're doing lessons online, you can have them put things up in the Jamboard. Parallel tasks. I can take a task and then I can create a parallel problem to it so that the students are working at the same level. So in the original problem, I can see that both of my problems, the original task and the parallel task, involve subtraction with a missing end result. Both involve regrouping, and both involve school situations. Though that's a context students are familiar with. But by changing the numbers, they have to regroup twice. In the parallel tasks, they're only regrouping once. And if I just change the numbers but keep the problem the same, oftentimes the children will say, or students will say, oh, that's the easier problem, I don't want it. So by changing the situation or the context slightly, they're seeing it as two different problems, and then they have the choice as to which one they want. But you can create that whole class discussion about subtraction with regrouping. Strategies for creating parallel tasks. Think about how students might differ developmentally in approaching a specific idea. Those, especially in the early elementary grades, that difference of a student coming in with an early October birthday and a student coming in with a late September birthday, they're a year apart, and that can make a big difference in what they're ready for and how they're ready for things. And then developing similar enough context for the choices that the common questions can be asked as students reflect upon their work and as you create those whole class discussions. And the good source is often the textbook you're already using. And then here are examples of parallel tasks at the different grade levels that you can take a look at when you get the link and can access the slides yourself. Tiered lessons is another way that we can access. So teachers use tiered tasks. So all students are focusing on the essential understandings and skills, but at different levels of complexity, abstractness, amount of scaffolding in, and the amount of open-endedness there may be. So we want to keep the focus on the tasks the same, but the routes for accessing the tasks are by varying the degrees of complexity within the problem. And we're using the same standards to inform the tiering, but we may see what in some of the tiers more scaffolding may need to be brought in to help the students access the grade level standard, as well as there may be scaffolding that allow students to go deeper into the standard or help connect in the progression to other grade levels. So first, we want to identify the grade level and subject, then the standard that we're working with or standards. What's the key concept and generalization we want? We want to make sure the students have the background necessary to be successful. So this is where we may need to keep in touch with vocabulary. Are they all understanding the words? So if you're doing a measurement activity in the early grades, when you say we're going to measure in feet, are they understanding you're using the unit of measure and not the feet on their own bodies? And then fifth, we want to determine which part of the lesson, the content, the process, or the product that we're going to tier. And then the type of tiering we're going to do. Is it going to be based on readiness, interest, learning style? And lastly, we want to develop the assessment component. So we're assessing the standard and the concept that we want the students to learn, but how they present it to us or what problems they use to show us that they learned this can differ. So the ultimate goal of differentiation is to meet the needs of the varied students in your classroom. So sometimes we can take a single question or task, and I'm using task interchangeably with problem, so that it's inclusive. We're opening it up so all students in front of us can access the question, and we can have And they can all participate in the discussion afterwards as we talk about how we solved it, what are the understandings that we need to have. And this way, every student becomes part of the larger learning conversation, and they feel that they're included in the math learning community you have in your classroom. So in the open problems, students can work individually or in groups. They can be students with multiple solutions or approaches. And the open-endedness really does provide that entry point for all students, as well as allow students to take further steps. They can go beyond the scope of what you were planning for your class. So open problems can meet the needs of many learners. They encourage thinking, not just repetition, focus on important math understandings, lead to rich mathematical discussions, and it extends strong learning and provides lots of assessment of learning info. So as you're looking at their work, as you're talking to them about how they're solving problems, as you're listening to their discussions amongst themselves and in the whole class discussion, you as the teacher are picking up a lot of information about what they're learning, what they really know, and what you may need to go back and work with them with. So here's an example of a open question. Choose numbers to put in the blank to make the statement true, or choose 3 numbers less than 100 to put on points A, B, and C on the number line, and explain why those numbers make sense, and then repeat with other numbers. And the older the students get, you can increase, larger, numbers less than 1 million, and have them to really think too about the magnitude. How are the numbers in relationship to each other? And again, we have examples here for each of the grade bands that you can take a look at and see once you get the slides. So strategies for creating open problems. We can just turn around the problem into we're looking for the question. So the Jeopardy approach. We can ask for similarities and differences. So choose 2 items and ask the students how they're like and how they're different. So how are 85 and 100 alike? And then how are they different? Just replacing a number with a blank, or giving the students choice. You can choose A or choose B to put in the blanks here. So there are X students in one class and Y in another. Choose 2 numbers and determine the total. And then we can give them the information and ask them to create a sentence or a problem that would fit those numbers. So create a sentence that includes the numbers 3 and 4, along with the words and more. So cautions though with open problems. We want to make sure that the problems we are giving them are mathematically meaningful, and we can think of what are the discussions we can build off of the answers the students give us. We want to make sure they're ambiguous enough that there are multiple entry points for students, but we don't want to make them so vague that we can't develop those conversations around them. And then any questions that are too specific that may target just a narrow level of understanding, or really just prescribe the steps the students need to follow rather than their problem solving as they approach. So we can take simple questions too, just to open up a closed problem. So I have 45 and 7/10 plus 15 and 2/10 equal. So I can take that closed question of just add these 2 values together to begin with a review to activate that prior knowledge. What 2 whole numbers do you think the answer will be between? So that means they have to estimate and round, which are both skills we want students to have. And then we can ask a question that's an extension. What would a question or story be for this problem? And then the other thing we can think about that goes back to our building math classroom are opening up problems through generalizing, reversibility, flexibility, using errors or points of confusion, equivalency, and multiple representations. So for those who weren't at our other webinar, the next slides provide some examples. And if you read the notes underneath, they'll tell you how, why those specific ways to open up problems are beneficial for both you and the student. So here's the closed problem, 96 plus 29, and then the generalized version and reversing the focus. And then we have flexibility questions. So we can just take those problems in the workbook and just ask, how are these problems alike and how are they different? And equivalency, how is it that 6x minus 3y equals 12 is equivalent to y equals negative 2x plus 4? And then points of confusion. Poor Alex is confused. He made some errors. Help him to figure out what he did wrong. And then we have some resources that we hope you'll explore that can pull in and help you as try and implement the differentiation in the classroom.
All right, so this is where we're going to wrap up and answer any questions. I know one of the Q&A questions that we had is a little bit earlier on in the presentation. We had somebody mention the fact that they use a lot of these different strategies, but they're getting resistance from students. Maybe they're trying to, be able to have parents have a little bit more flexible thinking, or not parents, but students to have that, but they're getting pushback from parents. This might also have to do with there's a whole group of parents out there that say, I don't understand this new math. And it's not necessarily new math. It's just really thinking about math differently. And I really, a lot of times in the classroom, students are so focused on the answer. I've had really good success with taking the whole answer out of the equation and saying, I don't even care what your answer is today. I want to talk about the strategies. This is how important it is. And the person who put the question in says they don't want to let it go. They're going to continue to push. And I would really encourage students to continue to collaborate. I know at the junior high level and at the high school level, students are less and less apt to really have this collaboration. It's a product of sort of what the last few years have been. And I would say continue to make sure that you are really putting it at the forefront of your instruction and not letting it go and not just meeting them where they're at. Continue to push them and continue to have them collaborate. And really, those mathematical practice standards are big. Those are where we're really going to focus and say, it doesn't matter what you're doing in your life, problem solving and being able to look at things in different ways is going to really carry over to anything that you do in your life. So I would continue to push that. If you have any other questions, definitely put them in. We have already gone just a few minutes over, so I just want to make sure we have another webinar coming up. The shell of the webinar for the ELA differentiation in the classroom is going to be very similar, but they will be talking more about how you're going to differentiate your ELA content rather than the math content. But again, differentiation and the general principles of differentiation will be the same in that particular webinar. But if you have some colleagues or if you teach ELA, you might take a peek at that and get some different strategies for differentiating ELA. Again, we're going to come off. There'll be a survey for you to fill out. If for some reason you have to peel off before I close this webinar out, the link will also be in your email tomorrow. And again, I'm Heather Jenkins. We had Annie Wallace also here. You can reach out to either one of us if you have any questions about anything that we talked about today. And yes, you are getting the slides. We will make sure that you get access to the Google Drive and the Google Slides that are going to be there, because all of the links are going to be able to help you in differentiating for your particular grade level. So we'll make sure you get those.
And please feel free to reach out with us for further questions or if you want further support in any of this.
All right. I think that we'll sign off for today. Thank you so much for staying the extra few minutes, and have a great rest of your day.